Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we are happy to welcome back to the program Samantha Dagres. She is a Young Voices contributor. Samantha, good to have you back on board. For those meeting you for the first time, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm very happy to be joining you again, Brian. I'm a communications advisor for a Montreal-based think tank called the Montreal Economic Institute. Currently based in Montreal. And yeah, pretty much me.
Okay. Now, you are here today specifically to talk about some things that are going on in Canada. And I have to admit, I probably spend way more time focused on, my own country, the United States, what's going on politically. But I have been impressed with a certain political leader, Mr. Poilievre, or Poilievre,
yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about this guy and about the message he has that, Canada's broken, but more government isn't the way to fix it. First of all, who is he?
So Pierre Poilievre has been a conservative member of parliament since I believe he was 24. So a true career politician. He's held several key positions as parliamentary secretary, but has really come onto the stage as obviously the Conservative Party leader and likely our next prime minister. So he obviously understands Ottawa and its workings and trappings very, very well. And I think he's coming to prominence in a moment where Canadians really feel exhausted with public policy, with government. We were experiencing a housing crisis. Access to healthcare is scarce. 6 million Canadians don't have a family doctor. We're in the midst of a productivity crisis where, GDP per capita has stayed at the same levels as 2014. So really, we're at an inflection point where people are pretty frustrated, and that's where we meet Mr. Poilievre.
So when would he have the opportunity to run for prime minister?
Well, so our electoral system is quite different from yours. Basically, at any point. So because the current governing party, the Liberals, are running with a minority government, they recently had an agreement to stay in power with the other left-wing party, the New Democrats, and the New Democrats have rescinded that agreement. So this means that whenever a non-confidence vote is tabled in the House of Commons, we could be at an election at any point if the majority of the members of parliament in the House vote that there is no confidence in government. But before, that was sustained with an agreement between the two parties that has dissolved. So the latest we can have an election is October of next year, but it can happen next week, truly.
Wow. I'm actually a little bit envious because I think here in the U.S. we're finding that there are some people who are getting tired of the status quo and ready for some change. Talk to me a little bit about the message about government getting too big, too bossy. Is this something that has become self-evident to Canadian citizens?
Certainly, it is. Over the course of just Trudeau's tenure, he was first elected in 2015, the size of just the federal bureaucracy has grown by 100,000 people. And no one in Canada could say with a straight face that our services are that much better, right? Like the population of Canada only has grown about 12 to 14%, but the federal bureaucracy has grown 43%, and our lives are not better for it. So there's this real sense that government is getting bigger, more, they're intervening more in our lives, but things aren't getting better. And this is just the feeling that Mr. Poilievre is really harnessing, that government is big, and it's actually the problem to a lot of the struggles that Canadians are facing. So just say on housing, we can't get enough housing built because he proposes that municipalities are getting in the way and obstructing that process. Healthcare is a problem because governments are, not letting independent providers come in and help ease the strain on our government-run healthcare system. So things like that, he's really bringing to the fore. And I think people are understanding that too much government is not always a good thing.
Samantha, you mentioned that he got into politics at a fairly young age. So I'm assuming he has a fairly good track record. I like his rhetoric. I think he's saying the right things. Does he have a track record that aligns with what he's saying?
Well, the problem with one of the problems with the Canadian political system is that we have very strict party loyalty, where if you're a member of the Conservative caucus, you can't necessarily stray away from the Conservative caucus. So by definition, he's been loyal to the party. His track record tracks with all other Conservatives, and certainly the Conservative government that we had under Stephen Harper. But what I'm really worried about is that he's really positioned himself as a principled Conservative, a small government Conservative. And through kind of the hints that he's laid out for us on policy proposals, say if he were to form government, it's not really clear how government size will shrink, how government will get out of our lives. And that really is the test. And I don't think in that regard, he's ever been in a decision-making position to actually, show that he's capable of doing this.
There's also the question too. Even if the citizenry is like, yes, we're ready for a lighter, more responsive government, but the people who work within government, the bureaucracy, for lack of a better term, it tends to fight pretty hard to keep its turf.
Oh, for sure. If and when Poilievre becomes prime minister, he is going to be met with a bureaucracy that is either actively hostile to what he wants to do or completely aloof. And this is something he will have to contend with, and it will, take a lot out of him and, his people and staffers, and they have to be prepared to fight that fight with a growing bureaucracy. And so this is why, the concern of being principled, of not just kind of doing what is easy and popular comes into, contention. Will he do the right thing? Will he actually take great strides in reducing government's role in our lives, or won't he? And to me right now, that's not clear.
Let me take a step back for a moment too, and just kind of gauge, where is the public's attitude with Trudeau? Are they, less than supportive? I'm trying to be diplomatic in how I say this. Generally, is there a less supportive attitude for Justin Trudeau?
Let's just say there's a large appetite for change. Some polls have him will have the Liberals being reduced to fourth party status, which means they would be one of the smallest parties in Parliament, were we to go into an election soon. So definitely Canadians have had their time with Justin Trudeau and are ready for a change.
So what can Poilievre do to solidify his position? Again, it sounds like he's saying the right thing when he says that, look, Canada's broken. He's not running the country down so much as he's acknowledging there are things that need to be fixed. What could he do to make sure that he is committed, or that there is a plan to make it happen?
Not coming out in support of 100% tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles would be a start, right? I think it's pretty common knowledge that tariffs really hurt consumers, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to be paying for it. And without getting too much, into the weeds, Canada has this large mandate to ban the sale of gas-powered vehicles by 2035, and basically all but barring cheaper options isn't going to help us get there. Another position the Conservatives have recently taken this week is voting in favor of increasing the old age security. That would mean adding $16 billion to the government's budget, or likely deficit spending. It signals stability with his steadfast position that government really needs to get out of the way.
Okay. I don't mean this as an insult, but it sounds like some of the same problems we're dealing with here in the USA are some of the same things that Canada is dealing with, and maybe some similar choices to be made. Again, we're talking with Samantha Dagres. She is a Young Voices contributor. Samantha, for people who wish to follow you and your work, what's the best way to find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Sam_Dagres. And if they are interested in the work we do at the Montreal Economic Institute, they can find us at iedm.org. Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Alex Rosado back to the program. We've had him on here before. Alex is a Young Voices contributor. And Alex, for those who are making your acquaintance for the first time, give us a little bit of your background.
Sure. Thank you again for having me. I'm Alex, and I work as a research fellow for Horizon Info Consult, and I just graduated from Gettysburg College this past May.
So I'm looking at an article that you wrote for the Duluth News-Tribune, and I'm going to have to confess something here. The title is Democrats Owe Minnesota's Representative Dean Phillips an Apology. I am not familiar with Dean Phillips, or at least I wasn't until I read your article, and then I went, oh, I didn't realize that he was actually a bit of a contender in the Democratic Party. Help me understand a little bit about the role that he played in the road to the White House for the Democratic Party this year, because he played a much bigger role than I would have thought.
The Ballad or Ballad of Dean Phillips is one that isn't sung by many people, but now as the campaign cycle continues, especially with the withdrawal of Joe Biden from his re-election campaign, you're seeing now a lot more people credit Dean Phillips as not only the architect of this plan, but someone who had the blueprint ready for display, but no one chose to read the signs on the wall.
Wow. I mean, you point out in the article, right up until that June 27th debate against Donald Trump, Biden's supporters and those within the Democratic Party insisted, he is fit as a fiddle. He's good to go. He's ready to run, for president. And then suddenly he was gone and kind of has been out to lunch in a figurative way ever since.
Well, there's a famous quote. I forget who said it, but this is how it ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. And I think that really is how the Biden campaign ended up crumbling, because of a lot of the gaffes that were self-inflicted by Joe Biden and a lot of the negative press that came right after that first debate. But even taking that out of the picture, Dean Phillips, the reason that he ran first and foremost was because he wanted an alternative vision for the Democratic Party. He said that someone who's just encroaching into their 80s now shouldn't be someone who's leading the quote-unquote next generation of political thinkers, leaders, and aspirants. It should be someone who's more in tune not only with the nation's wants and needs, but also someone who can be energetic as an executive figure. And you've seen some of those gaffes, like at COP26, where Joe Biden fell asleep. You saw that with calling President Zelensky of Ukraine, calling him Putin at the NATO conference this past July. And then even one of the more alarming ones was a Congresswoman, Jackie Walorski, passed away in a car accident. A month after that happened in 2023, Biden said on stage, "Where's Jackie? Where's Jackie?" And everyone just looked at each other and they said, maybe we really do need a change if the mental acuity of this president isn't up to snuff with what we need.
So who were some of the alternatives that Phillips was suggesting might be ready to step up and bear the banner?
Originally, he didn't want to step into the race. Dean Phillips was someone who wanted to work behind the scenes. And originally, he wanted to reach out to Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer to run. He saw them as statewide figures that had a lot of fundraising capabilities, someone who can have a national image and really lead the charge of the next generation of Democrats who are becoming more and more progressive. But neither of them wanted to do it. They said, we are riding with Joe Biden all the way. So Dean Phillips kind of backed himself into a corner by, instead of being someone who was a recruiter, he became the recruited, but only at his own expense. He really sacrificed his political career for it. He was on the head of the House Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. He stepped down in October 2022 to run his own campaign. It's a good thing he's a multimillionaire, as his family owns a distilling company that enriched the family, and that was able to self-fund him for most of the campaign. But in terms of outreach and fundraising, he really didn't have those necessary fundamental requirements to really stage a real primary challenge to Joe Biden.
Well, as you point out in your article, he appears to have been somewhat prophetic in terms of, having that second string in place in case Biden was no longer there. Give me your thoughts on Kamala Harris, because the circumstances under which she was appointed to succeed Joe as the candidate, It seems to me that the democratic process of having voters or delegates actually elect her kind of was bypassed.
Absolutely. And this is something that even happened with the Joe Biden presidential campaign in 2024 that happened as well. The Democratic National Committee got together and they canceled all primary debates. They say, Dean Phillips, RFK Jr., Marianne Williamson, we know that you guys are legitimate challengers, but we're not going to give you the time of day to air out your grievances, air out your alternative visions for the country. So they canceled all of them. The Florida and Delaware Democratic primaries also got canceled. There was no way for those voters to project their wants and wishes onto the electorate at large. And South Carolina was moved up in terms of having a firewall for Joe Biden because Jim Clyburn ultimately saved Joe Biden's 2020 presidential campaign by endorsing him last minute. And that's what got him the push that he needed in Super Tuesday. So they moved that up to say, well, if there are any doubts about Joe Biden, we're going to make sure the people in South Carolina have the first say. So it seemed that there's a guise of support for him. And with Kamala Harris, they said, we don't even need to have any primaries or debates or forums or panels. We're just going to make her the Democratic nominee, whether or not you like it. And it seems to be that most Democrats don't really care. They're completely fine with it.
Interesting. And look, I know I'm coming at this from a less than objective point of view, but just observing Kamala Harris on the campaign trail, it seems like it takes a supreme amount of effort from the people around her as well as much of the legacy media to prop her up and make her appear viable. I'm not seeing her bringing as much to the table as perhaps some of those other potential candidates that you mentioned.
Well, at least those other alternative candidates went to national platforms and outlets to tell a wide span of voters, whatever race, color, creed they may be, that's something that they can unite around in terms of policy. But Kamala's campaign is devoid of policy. For the first 6 weeks since she jumped into the race and forced Joe Biden out, there was not a policy section on her campaign website. Well, now you see in this current week, she's going on a quote-unquote media blitz, but it really isn't a media blitz if you're playing to your own people. And you're really getting the sense that she's playing it safe. She's going on The View, which is a very democratic and liberal show. They're going to reinforce whatever policies and notions she has. She's going on the Howard Stern show. Once a shock jock has now become the anti-Trump establishment. You're seeing her even now go on podcasts that have a sexual nature to them, even though that's not what most voters want to hear. We want to see policy. We want to see results. Hurricane Helene is a great way to show that you can have executive leadership, but she's floundering on that with the FEMA funds. You're seeing now, even with the 1-year anniversary of Israel and Hamas conflict, you need strong leadership to resolve that. You're not seeing it at all. And just even on issue after issue, it's a recurring pattern of negligence and complacency.
Well, even when she is teed up with softball questions, again, and you mentioned many of these shows that she's appearing on, even the news interviews are very sympathetic to her, and yet it appears that she really flounders when it comes to trying to come up with a cohesive, intelligible answer.
Absolutely, and substance should be the core of what politics is, but as politics and entertainment become converged, you see that the priorities are shifting elsewhere. Perhaps Kamala doesn't need to have all of the right answers or even any explanation for what she does, because in this cycle, what matters most is that you're not Donald Trump. And that's right. What a lot of people care about. They don't care about, say, even though it's listed as high enough issues, the economy and immigration, they say, well, ultimately Donald Trump's character is disqualifying. Well, you should take a look at Kamala's record for herself, and I think her character shows in that as well.
Again, we're talking with Alex Rosado. Alex, I have to ask you one last question here. Is it likely that Dean Phillips is going to be a player after this election, either within a Harris campaign or Harris administration, or for that matter, as opposition to Trump, should he be elected?
He's not running for re-election to the House of Representatives, and I think in a way that's the correct way for him to go. It's quietly into the night, and he'll be under-recognized and under-deserved, but truly he's the one who made a transformative movement in this election, and he should be given the credit that he deserves.
Yeah, let the record show he called it. Alex, how do people follow you? Where can they find your work?
You can follow me on Twitter/X at Alex P. Rosado.
All right, great to visit with you. Looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome back to this segment Andrew Davenport, who is a Young Voices contributor. Andrew, good to see you once again.
Thanks for having me back, Ryan.
So tell us just a little bit about yourself. This is for the sake of people who are meeting you for the first time. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I am a policy and research associate with the California Policy Center, and I mainly focus on issues relating to education and municipal finance.
Well, we've got a doozy of a topic to discuss today as it comes to public policy, and that is the California state's educational challenges. Tell me about the teacher housing folly. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the story kind of starts with our state superintendent of public instruction, Tony Thurmond. He has relatively recently announced that he will be running for governor in 2026. So as part of that process, he has kind of launched this new initiative that he's declaring related to building teacher housing. So this his proposal is for building 2.3 million housing units, and this is proposed to be built on basically surplus land that's actually owned by school districts. So it's this big government initiative that he's pushing to likely raise his profile and increase teacher housing, which is housing shortages are no doubt a huge issue in California. So there is something to this issue of having teacher housing shortages due to inability of teachers to be able to afford housing and such. So no doubt an issue that California does face, but we'll get into some of the details about why this specific project is not exactly on target.
I can imagine this goes over pretty well, though, with the teachers' unions.
Yeah, no doubt. So the teachers' unions and government public sector unions are some of Tony Thurmond's largest donors and supporters for his campaign. So there's a lot of aspects to this initiative that no doubt appeal to the public sector unions.
So let's talk a little bit about when it comes to teachers. I know California is a massive economy. I mean, I think if you line it up against some of the different countries in the world, it would be like in the top 10 or maybe even in the top 7 in terms of, national economies, in terms of its size. How much of that economy is centered around public education? Is it like many states? Is that one of the bigger expenditures in terms of the system that needs to be supported?
Yeah, no doubt. The teaching field is huge in California, and it definitely makes up a big part of a lot of the spending that comes from the top and at the state level. And with the California Teachers Association, which is one of the largest teachers unions in the country, they're constantly lobbying for higher wages, more pay, just generally always lobbying to kind of increase those budgets for education in the state. Man, it sounds like the stakes would be very high. I have to ask you, is there a good chance, is there a dissatisfaction with Gavin Newsom that he could actually, is he planning on running for re-election? I mean, is he still? No, so he won't be up for re-election. So there's a number of different members of his current administration that are kind of lobbying for support and vying for kind of that position in 2026 to take his spot. So one of those being Tony Thurmond, the current state superintendent of public instruction. Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of building housing for teachers. As I understand it, the cost of housing is extremely high in California. Is this something that can be done in a cost-effective way, or is this likely to be more expensive than he is anticipating in terms of the costs he's citing? Yeah, no doubt. The costs that he cites, so just to back up and give some numbers here. So as part of the initiative, Thurmond has kind of outlined about $500 million in tax credits and money available for this project, which is really just a minuscule amount compared to overall numbers here and kind of relative to what this actual project would encompass. So if we look at something like Project Home Key, which was Gavin Newsom's homelessness housing project. So they announced that they built roughly around 15,000 housing units back in January. And that project itself was about $400 million in state general funds and about $3 billion in federal funding. So just a massive amount of money. But that in that case, that was merely just transitioning a lot of existing housing units, so not actually building new housing units. But that was one case where the budget just was massively inflated. But looking at numbers for this specific project, they were relying on a research report from several California think tanks, and they were outlining sample unit costs of around $500,000. So when you look at that, you're looking at over like $1 trillion for roughly with their estimates. If we went with the Project Homekey estimates, which were more around the $140,000 mark, even at that price for 2.3 million housing units, which is what they're aiming for, you're still talking about over $330 billion. So just a massive amount of money relative to what Thurmond is aiming to do.
Okay, so let me take a step back just for a moment and just hopefully I'm not throwing a curveball at you here, but let's talk a little bit about why is housing so incredibly expensive in California? Is it just simply competition for places to live that drives those prices, or does regulation play a part in that high cost?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point to bring up, because if we're going to talk about teacher housing shortages, I think we need to more broadly talk about housing shortages in general. And teachers aren't the only ones affected by this. The housing shortages are something that is definitely caused by regulation, most notably the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA as it's commonly referred to, is one of the most stringent environmental regulations in the country. And what CEQA does is it creates a laundry list of regulatory hurdles for developers, basically, where they have to go through environmental impact studies, and a lot of other regulation that ends up driving prices up, and then also driving down the number of projects that these developers are able to take on. You also have a lot of unions and environmental groups that utilize lawsuits, and it's a tactic called greenmailing. And what they do is they use litigation via CEQA and these regulations to sue these developers, delay housing projects, and basically demand concessions from the developers. The unions a lot of times are seeking higher wages or exclusive contracts to build. So this, generally speaking, is a huge issue. And even in Thurmond held a conference about this initiative, and some of his panel members brought up CEQA as the biggest obstacle and hurdle to this initiative, and more generally to housing developers. And he kind of acknowledged it, but sort of brushed it off, and also reiterated his support for CEQA. So because of his massive union backers, there's no doubt that Thurmond will actually take any action on the CEQA reform. So if he was actually really serious about building more housing and improving the situation for teachers, then he would definitely be seek some type of deregulation as it relates to CEQA.
Well, you answered my next question, which was, so is there any prospect of, reining in the California Environmental Quality Act? Doesn't sound like as long as there's influence to be wielded by those who can use it, to their advantage, that it's going to be going anywhere.
Yeah, no signs of it going anywhere. I think there's a lot of public awareness that's building around CEQA and the problems that it's created as it relates to housing. But just due to supermajority control that exists in the state right now, there's unlikely to be a lot of movement there, or a lot of sentiment or willingness by the leaders to really make changes.
I love in your article where you point out that, look, rather than turning these school districts into housing developers, and if they're trying to deal with surplus land, why not sell it to help pay down the massive pension debt? That's one of the things I have heard about California is there's a ticking time bomb in the form of all those pensions that are going to have to be paid in the not so distant future.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons that there's so much surplus land is the declining enrollment. We've seen a lot of flight and exodus out of California, with people moving to other states that have lower regulation. So what I propose in the article is, hey, if they're going to have all this surplus land, instead of turning school districts into housing developers, sell off that land and use that money to be paying off a lot of these debts.
Again, we're talking with Andrew Davenport. Andrew, where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at AndrewDAV18. You can also find my work at CaliforniaPolicyCenter.org.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment of Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Jeffrey Schulman back to the program. He's a Young Voices contributor and a PhD student in ancient history at Groningen University. Jeffrey, great to see you once again.
Yep, nice talking to you again.
So, for those who are meeting you for the first time, take just a moment to give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, so I work personally. I'm a scholar of ancient history, particularly the Greeks and Romans is sort of what I do. And so I do a lot of my research, particularly on political history. And so particularly also then some of the historians who are really big on writing about that and sort of contextualizing what happened politically in the ancient world, and also talking a little bit about sort of what that means for today and what lessons that can bring.
Yeah, I saw the title of your article in nationalinterest.org, Rethinking the Thucydides Trap. And I love, going into the classics. And this was great because it's been a long time since I've sat down and read, Thucydides and, his account of the Peloponnesian War. But when we talk about the Thucydides Trap and likening what happened between Sparta and Athens, let's make that connection. What could we learn from what happened with Thucydides, what he describes, and how does it apply to us today?
Yeah, great. And so for people who aren't that familiar with it, right, we have to go way back to about the middle of the 400s BC. So about 2,500 years ago, when you have these Greek city-states, you have Athens, very democratic, Sparta, much more tough guy, authoritarian, smaller political system. Athens is growing more powerful, and so they start essentially a massive Greek war that ties in a lot of other city-states. And so this has been compared a little bit of what happened to U.S. relations today with China, because the historian Thucydides, and he gives his name to this Thucydides trap who wrote about it, he sort of explained how in the lead up to the war, Thucydides himself came from Athens. He sort of explained that because Athens was growing more powerful, but Sparta was really the established power, had a lot of allies, a lot of support. There grew up this suspicion. The Spartans became sort of very afraid, concerns. And so the rising power and the established power, he says, just those power relations made war almost inevitable. And so then there's the question that a lot of foreign policy scholars have asked, okay, if China is a rising power, if the United States is an established power, is it certain we're going to go to war? Is Thucydides' sort of prophecy true?
No, I think that's a fair question to ask. And so how would you answer that question? Is it in the stars that conflict is going to come between these two powerful nations at some point?
Yeah, and so one thing I try to do, right, because this is a much debated question, is sort of look a little bit more about what Thucydides is talking about. And certainly he identifies this pressure between rising and established power. But part of what affects both the war, but the course of the war, is the sort of growing political instability, particularly in Athens, where although a democracy, sort of at the beginning of this period, Athens is very well governed. But there's just increasing conflicts between the sort of upper class, highly educated establishment guys who are a little bit suspicious of sort of the democracy and influence of voters, and then populist demagogues who really take a hard line against some of the aristocracy, some of the more highly educated. And this, as Thucydides sort of notes, this causes politics to spiral out of control. It not only contributes to there being a war, but also contributes to Athens making a lot of foolish decisions that cause them to lose the war. And so that, I think, is really, and what I'm arguing is it's a danger of political instability, just as much as the power sort of difference that poses sort of the risk of war and ultimately defeat today.
Interesting. So, looking around, especially at the U.S., I'm not seeing a growing degree of political stability. Should we be nervous?
I think so, right? And so, one thing sort of Thucydides tells a whole bit about, right, is the Athenians midway through this war decide, you know what, they've got a little truce with Sparta going on. They're going to go start another war with Syracuse, a city out in Sicily. It's one of the most powerful of the Greek states after Sparta. And essentially, they just get into this because of like the political conflicts that are happening, sort of leads them to make a foolish decision, and then a series of foolish decisions to sort of bite off more they can chew, because sort of politicians are looking to get over the other side and are looking to their personal glory in some ways more than they're really sort of thinking about the interests of the country. And so that's right, a real, I think, big risk that we're also grappling with today is this sort of changed political culture where like the ruthless sort of politics lead to serious, serious mistakes and ultimately dumb wars.
So, Jeffrey, talk to me a little bit. If America is kind of like Sparta, the established power, talk to me about how China bears resemblance to Athens.
And that's another point I sort of try to make in my sort of article, is that the resemblances are a little bit complicated, right? Because in some ways, as you put it out, America's like Sparta. We're the established power. We have a large network of allies. Most of those allies aren't too worried about what we're going to do. But at the same time, right, and where there's just getting to it, the political instability is we're a lot like Athens, where we're this robust democracy, where politicians are, saying extraordinary things back and forth. There are, very controversial public debates happening all the time. Constant, elections and votes that go down to the wire with all the problems that cause. Whereas Sparta is essentially, a really authoritarian state where, shut up or else, to put it simply, which looks right a lot more like the Chinese Communist Party, particularly under Xi Jinping. So I think that there's a real interesting contrast, which makes this relevant. But you also then want to make sure that you don't make the mistakes the Athenians did, or ultimately the Spartans did, who get taxed very highly by this war and sort of wind up in trouble later. And so I think the real key there that sort of worked for the Spartans is the political stability, but that also you can grow faster if you don't have that sort of authoritarian system.
So let's talk about for U.S. politicians, if they want to chart a course that isn't destined to end up in conflict with China, what are the smartest things that they can and should be doing now? Yeah,
and that's that's the $1 million question we're all thinking about, right? And I would say, the real key there is, I think it has a lot to do with political culture, with de-escalating tensions, where if you see beating the other side as sort of your chief objective, and you sort of see this happening in Athens too, where people are sort of proposing foolish expeditions, foolish sort of military campaigns just to boost themselves, right? If you see beating the other side as in some ways more important than the national interests, if you're not willing to sort of, accept, okay, I think my political opponents are less bound than maybe a hostile dictator, that sort of prioritization is the key. And it's a case where I think that, we could really you need to turn down the volume a little bit politically, if you will. I'm sure that's something everybody, all your listeners are familiar with, the crazy volume here. So.
No, I agree with you. And I like that you point out, we haven't yet fallen into a genuine Thucydides trap, but it certainly appears that we are skirting the edges. And I don't know that we can do that indefinitely without risk.
Yep, exactly.
So one quick question here. We've got about a minute left. As far as China goes, are they more predictable in terms of how they go about their business? It seems to me that for as authoritarian as the Chinese government appears to be, they're much more stable.
Yeah, no, I think that question of stability is very important, and it just has a lot to do with sort of the political culture we're in. And so in a way, I get, turning down the volume, I keep saying that is harder to do than you think. But I think it also just comes with sort of needing to rebuild some of those social bonds that we have if we don't want to sort of find ourselves. Athens ultimately, even for a period, there's just sort of a authoritarian system installed mid-war. If we don't want to lose our democracy, we sort of have to find a better way to talk to each other.
Once again, we are talking with Jeffrey E. Schulman. He's a contributor for Young Voices. Jeffrey, where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key is if you go to Jeffrey E. Schulman, Groningen, that's Groningen in Google, you'll see my university page with like a lot of the details. So